Hello ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we're back with another deck tech. I figured I'd do something very special for you today and show you one of my EDH decks because I figured I haven't really been paying that much attention to EDH as of lately. But today I figured it'd be nice and to show off my Maelstrom Wanderer deck. In case you're not familiar with what it does, Maelstrom Wanderer is a 7/5 elemental creature. Of course he's legendary. He is the general. He costs 5, a blue, a red, and a green, and he has creatures I control have haste, including Maelstrom Wanderer himself, and he has Cascade, which means I get to Cascade twice, one right after the other, not at the same time. The reason you may want to play a deck like this is because the deck is really explosive and plays a lot of spells that are just very dynamic, just huge. A lot of Maelstrom Wanderer decks are known for playing some pretty degenerate things. Mine I don't think is quite as mean, but I don't think I would consider it nice. Anyway, let's get into the deck. Now before we begin, I just want to say that a lot of Maelstrom Wanderer decks are known for two really infamous cards, which are Jokulhaups and Palinchron. Jokulhaups is kind of annoying because you can actually set it up with something like a Scry or a Mystical Tutor and cascade into the Jokulhaups, destroy pretty much everything on the table, and then get another spell. Palinchron is particularly annoying, not just in this deck, but almost any deck where you have a double mana fixer, which is usually very common in blue-green decks. Essentially, you gain infinite mana, and if you have a way to keep cloning Palinchron or keep spamming the trigger ability of it entering the battlefield, you can just pretty much take control of the whole game, and it's really not fun, and a lot of people really dislike it. Considering mana doublers are very common, it's very easy to do this, even if you don't own the mana doubler yourself. So let's kick off the actual deck now. Starting off, we have the Sensei's Divining Top. This is pretty easy why this is here. It goes hand in hand with the Maelstrom Wanderer. You can top to look at the top card of your library and make sure that the card you cascade into is worth cascading into. Pretty nifty. Soul Ring is Soul Ring. I didn't have to explain much there. Mana Vault kind of serves the same purpose as Soul Ring, and since we actually have a lot of ways to untap permanents, we can easily get around its pay for to untap it clause. Thought Vessel's kind of nifty. I know not everyone runs these, but I like it because I draw a lot of cards, and the no maximum hand size clause is pretty sweet. Darksteel Ingot, just because I like having a mana rock that can't be blown to bits, and it's pretty nice. I get any color. And Gilded Lotus, just because I like having a ton of mana. Usually when we get this out, we are usually guaranteed to get a Maelstrom Wanderer on the next turn, and it's pretty darn awesome. Moving on to ramp spells, we have Explore, Sakura Tribe-Elder, which is just rampant growth that can block, Coiling Oracle, which is kind of a coin flip here. We either get ramp or a card, which is nice either way. We have Kodama's Reach, which is some nice extra ramp, and thins out our deck a little bit so we can cascade into the big bomby spells. Explosive Vegetation, which is just double rampant growth, gives us a nice boost. Little enchantment here, Rites of Flourishing. This is a Howling Mine, and I guess you can say a Universal Explorer, or Exploration, I guess. Really nice. This actually kind of gives your opponent kind of a feel that you're kind of trying to help them out, and usually most players will just let it stay on the table. It's actually pretty nice, but it's not necessarily something you always want to cascade into. Next is Mina and Den Wildborn. These guys are pretty sweet. They give us an extra land each turn, and we can give Maelstrom Wanderer Trample. If you don't have Mina and Den, they're really not that hard to find, but another good substitute is the Oracle of Moldiah. That's a really good one. But I'm using this for now, and it's been working pretty good for me. Even though it is legendary, the advantage of having Oracle is you can actually clone it. Ral Zarek, mainly used for mana advantage. By mana advantage, it means we can untap our lands and use them for extra mana. The ultimate actually has been used for my case quite a few times, and it's pretty sweet. I know my copy's in Chinese, but it allows us to take up to 5 extra turns if we flip 5 heads on a coin. Next up is my Foil Garrick Wild Speaker. Mainly for more mana advantage, we occasionally may need a creature and an overrun, but it's mainly used for mana advantage. That's my main intent, but if you manage to have it stick around more, the extra effects are just goodies. Kiara the Crashing Wave for some, I guess you could say, extra explorations. It's actually also quite nifty. The +1 is actually good if you know you're going up against generals or decks that win by general damage. So that can be really nifty too. I think in all my time playing this deck, I've never managed to get the ultimate going though. So that may not be the case if you decide to run Kiora, but the other two effects are really good. Moving on to card advantage and ramp, we have Urban Evolution. This basically does just what I said, card advantage and ramp. What's not to love? We have Nissa's Renewal, which is, I guess you could say, life advantage and ramp. I won't say it's life advantage, because life usually is not always the most relevant thing in EDH, but this is the only spell in our deck that gives us life, and it gives us 3 lands, which is pretty sweet. Next up, we have Ristic Study, which is a pretty universal EDH card. The only tough thing about it is you have to remember its trigger. Just don't forget its trigger. Mole Drifter, just a nice little creature we can clone for some card advantage. Next up is Seasons Past, and Seasons Past is just nuts in this deck because basically if the game is going long, we can just get everything we used back again. And it's just terrific and a blast to cascade into. Coming up next, I guess you could say we have kind of our mana advantage cards, which, like I said earlier, is the cards that untap lands so we can use them again. First up is Plea for Power, and more often than not, this will just give you card advantage, but depending on the state of the game, you can get an extra turn if everyone wants to vote for it. This is also a really fun card for everyone on the table just because of the voting clause. Turn Mat, which can be mana advantage or kind of a cryptic command-like effect. Tap all of your opponent's creatures or artifacts or lands. Basically burn your opponent out for a turn or reset your table. It's pretty sweet. Next up is a card I don't see very often in EDH, which is Nature's Will. If you know you're going to be tagging with Maelstrom Wanderer a lot, which you should be, you'll basically get an ass load of mana advantage. It's so good, and it really does work wonders. I'm surprised this doesn't see a whole lot of play in the format. Rude Awakening, because mana advantage is sweet. I don't really use the claws or the entwine to get the lands to become creatures, but it's a sweet card overall, and it does allow you to play a lot of additional spells. Speaking of other cards that do this, you can use Treachery to not only mind control a creature, but untap 5 lands. Just a solid card overall. Great for stealing your opponent's general and beating your opponents to death with it. A lot of fun. Next up, we have our 2 Time Warp cards. We don't use any Time Warp effect like Temporal Mastery, which exiles itself. So these Time Warps are completely abusable with all the cards that could potentially get them back in our hand. This is essentially what makes the deck real pain in the butt for some players because we can get infinite turns if the game goes late enough. If you don't want to play Time Warps, one thing you can use to replace them and make people like you a bit more is, I guess my suggestions would be Woodland Balor and Green Warden of Marassa. Time Spiral for some obvious mana advantage, and New Hands of Cards also gets everyone into the game by ruining their hands and making them cry. Teferi the Temporal Archmage, and no, he's not our general, he's just a nice planeswalker that gives us some mana advantage or extra cards, and that's always nice. Like Kiora, I haven't been able to do the ultimate either, and that's a shame because I do run a lot of planeswalkers. Next up is another card I'm surprised hasn't seen a whole lot of play in EDH, and this is Zendikar Resurgent. This is basically almost like a mana reflection. It is a little different as it just doubles your mana produced from lands, but it's also nice because we do run a fair amount of creature spells, so getting extra value from casting creature spells is always good. Honestly, I think Mana Reflection is like a $20 card, and this I think is like 50 cents, so I'm surprised that more people are not running this, especially because Mana Reflection is just such a great card and a very popular one at that. Next up, we have our 3 counter spells. These are essentially the only counter spells that are playable in this deck, considering anything else will just more than likely cascade and whiff on something. Izzet Charm is a nice versatile spell, allows us to spell pierce something, or do 2 damage to a creature, or give us a Careful Study. Cryptic Command is essentially this deck's only hard counter, but it's like Izzet Charm, it's a very versatile spell. And finally we have Mystic Confluence, the newest member of the crew, giving us either a card advantage or a lot of unsummons and mana leaks. Next up we have the spells that destroy artifacts and enchantments, first off with Destructive Revelry, which I guess if you don't want to do damage you could run Naturalize instead. Crossing Grip, which is just nice, get their spell, plays around counter magic. And Decimate, which, well, Decimate destroys practically everything. Next up we have I guess you could say, the big juicy spells that you want to cascade into. Eternal Witness is only 3 mana, but my god, when you clone this thing, it just gets ridiculous. And I mean, who doesn't love Eternal Witness? Phyrexian Metamorph, just so we have some nice clones, but we can also clone artifacts, and that leads to several clones of Gilded Lotus. Next up is the Xenagod, God of Revels. This thing basically allows us to cut down our commander damage clock from a 3-turn clock to a 2-turn clock. And like I say, if you have a way to give Maelstrom Wanderer trample, then things get really hectic. Next up is Ethereum Horn Sorcerer. This guy is maybe not the most necessary creature, but he's a lot of fun to play with. I could probably replace him with something else, considering he does give us some value, but considering the spell you will cascade into will be 5 or less, you may go over a spell that you may have wanted to cast that cost more. Next up is, I guess you could say, our instant and sorcery stealing creatures. We have Diluvian Primordial and the Chancellor of the Spires. Both of them have their benefits. Diluvian copies a spell from each player's graveyard, but it exiles the spells. And Chancellor just copies one spell from one player's graveyard, but it leaves it in there, so if you can clone the Chancellor, you can get it back some more if you need to. Next we have the Sphinx of Bethune. This is basically Factor Fiction on a big flying Sphinx. And finally we have Avenger of Zendikar. This guy's also a lot of fun to clone. He also makes your ramp spells that may have appeared to be useless a lot more useful because of the landfall trigger with all these plants. And the deck does run a ton of lands, so you're going to get a lot of plants and a lot more triggers. Next up we have the juicy non-creature spells that you could say we put in here. I have Brainstorm in this pile simply because it allows us to, I guess you could say, cascade into something that we want. But you kind of have to be careful with it because it can kind of lead you into some sort of deadlocks if you have a lot of spells that you don't want to cast. For spells that you do want to cast, you have Mystical Tutor. This is pretty much essential in a Maelstrom Wanderer deck just because it allows you to get that one spell you need at the right time, and it's pretty darn solid. Speaking of things at instant speed, I run a copy of Leyline of Anticipation. Can you say instant speed Maelstrom Wanderer? This is a kind of goofy one. This is Jace the Living Guild Pact. I mainly use this thing for its -3. Oddly enough, to bounce Maelstrom Wanderer back to my hand and get more cascade effects. If you have Jace the Mind Sculptor, you should probably be running that instead, but I don't not have Jace the Mind Sculptor at the moment. So we're using this instead, and for what he does, he's actually pretty good. Next we have Rite of Replication, which is one of the ways we get our massive army of cloned creatures, and a lot of board presence. And yes, you can actually pay Kicker off Cascade, just keep that in mind. This is a kind of goofy one. This is Ledgerman, which is kind of a switcheroo for either creatures or artifacts. Not the worst card, but I think I can replace it with something a little more explosive, but it's still good for what it is. Bribery is a card that's much more explosive. This allows us to take any creature from one of our opponent's libraries and put it onto the battlefield. Stolen Identity is the other way we have to clone things. Like Phyrexian Metamorph, this can also be used to clone artifacts, and once it's ciphered on a creature, you can basically beat face that creature multiple times and get multiple copies of whatever creature or artifact you'd like. Spell Twine is basically build your own spell. It's actually a lot of fun. You can make anything you have come back from the graveyard, as well as combining it with one of your opponent's spells. We got Knowledge Exploitation for even more shenanigans with our opponent's instants and sorceries. And Blatant Thievery, because we just love stealing our opponent's stuff. For the replacements I'm using right now for Jokulhaups and Palinchron, I'm using Destructive Force, which is, I guess we could say Jokulhaups Light, only does 5 damage to each creature, and sacrifices 5 lands. No artifacts were harmed in the making of the spell. And over here in my right hand is Mind's Dilation, which is the new card from Eldritch Moon. Next is the lands. There are 40 lands here. I'll let you look by them. We have Is it Boilerworks, Is it Guildgate, Shivan Reef, Sulphur Falls. These are the red-blue lands, if you haven't figured that out by now. Temple of the Epiphany, Steam Vents, Green-Blue, Cement Guildgate, Cement Growth Chamber. We use the Karo lands to get more advantage with our mana advantage cards. Carplucian Forest, Temple of Abandon, Rebound Crag, Stomping Ground, our Tri-Land, Frontier Bivouac, Command Tower, City of Brass, some nice multicolor lands. I have some mana fixing here with Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. I could run actual fetches, like the Scalding Tarns, etc., but they're not necessary if you're planning on making a deck like this. Ancient Tomb is a pretty necessary card, I will say, though, because it's just gets you so much mana and ramps you really good. Same thing with Temple of the False God, gets you to your Maelstrom Wanderer, and you can use Thespian Stage to clone them. A lot more depths just to get a good cascade off the top. And we just have basics, which is I run 6 islands, 6 forests, and 3 mountains, just because green and blue are more prominent in my deck. But if you would like to run a different list, you can run whatever suits you best. And there you have it. That's Maelstrom Wanderer. And like I say, this is a very fun deck, very explosive. This is my first deck tech of an EDH deck. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've learned something. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, as everyone deserves to have the knowledge of Magic the Gathering, and doing so will help this video get out there. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is Ryu Spectre, and I'll see you all next time.